I walked away thinking she cheated after our anniversary dance. 2 years later, the truth finally came out. Our 10th wedding anniversary was supposed to be a celebration, a marker of all the years we had survived and grown together. I had planned everything: reservations at the restaurant where we had our first date, a playlist of our favorite songs from over the years, and even a surprise gift I had been saving up for. A small trip to the coast, just the two of us. No work distractions, no phones. I wanted to reignite whatever spark had dulled in the daily routines. But things started feeling off before the night even began. Rachel seemed distracted the whole week. She was glued to her phone more than usual, giggling at texts she wouldn't explain, brushing off my questions with vague answers like, just work stuff. I tried not to assume the worst, telling myself not to be paranoid. Still, a feeling crept in. Something wasn't right. That night at the restaurant, she looked stunning, radiant even, but distant. Her laughs felt hollow, her eyes kept drifting away, and every time her phone buzzed, she flinched. I swallowed my unease and pushed through dinner, telling myself it was all in my head. Then came the moment that cracked it all open. After dessert, a live band began playing slow jazz, and couples started dancing. I was about to ask her to dance when a tall man in a sharp navy suit came over and extended his hand to her. She glanced at me quickly, guiltily maybe, then stood up and walked with him to the floor. I sat frozen, watching my wife of 10 years smile and move to the music in another man's arms. It wasn't just a friendly dance. It was too close, too intimate. She leaned in to say something to him, and he laughed, touching the small of her back. I felt heat rise in my chest, my palms sweating. I could barely think. I excused myself, walked out, and stood in the cold night air, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. When she came out minutes later, I didn't even wait for her explanation. I told her we were done, that I couldn't trust her, and I left. That night, I drove around for hours, ending up at a motel on the edge of town, my mind spiraling with betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak. The days that followed were a blur of boxes, silence, and avoidance. I packed up my things while Rachel stayed at her sister's place. We barely exchanged any words, just the necessary logistics of separating our lives. It was like a part of me had been ripped out, and all that was left was raw confusion and a sense of betrayal I couldn't shake. I kept playing that scene over and over again in my head, her laughing, swaying, whispering to that man. I didn't need proof of anything more. That moment alone had been enough to shatter what we had. I moved into a small apartment across town and threw myself into work. I took on extra shifts, started jogging every morning, even started therapy, not because I thought I needed to be fixed, but because I didn't know what else to do with all the questions spinning around inside me. How could someone I trusted with my heart for a decade look so happy in someone else's arms? Friends tried to support me, but most were mutual and didn't want to take sides. Some suggested I overreacted. Others said maybe I should have let her explain, but no one had seen what I saw. No one felt that cold snap in my chest when I realized the woman I loved could so easily forget I existed, even for one night. Months turned into a year. I didn't date. I couldn't. Every time I thought about moving on, I imagined facing that kind of betrayal again. I buried myself in solitude, letting the wound scab over without really healing. Sometimes I'd see Rachel's name pop up on social media. Pictures with coworkers, brunch with friends. She looked happy. I couldn't tell if it was real or just the curated version of her life. Once I ran into her by accident at a grocery store. We froze. She looked like she wanted to say something, but I walked away. I couldn't face her. I told myself she didn't deserve closure. Not after what she did, or what I thought she did. I didn't want to hear any excuses, any versions of the truth that could make me question my decision. I had already built a new life on that decision. Going back would have meant tearing it all down. As the second year rolled in, the pain had dulled, but never disappeared. I had rebuilt a version of my life, stable, quiet, and predictable. Yet beneath the surface, everything still felt off, like I was living someone else's life. I never unpacked most of the boxes from the move. My apartment still had that half-moved-in look, and I avoided anything that reminded me of the past. No photos, no wedding album, not even our old playlists. I kept busy, but every so often I'd catch myself wondering what really happened that night. It wasn't that I wanted her back. I convinced myself of that. It was just that the not knowing had begun to rot something inside me. Then, one afternoon out of nowhere, I got a letter. A real physical letter. It was from Rachel. I stared at the envelope for hours before opening it, afraid of what it might say, afraid it might unearth the emotions I had spent so long trying to bury. Her handwriting looked the same, which felt like a punch to the gut. The letter was short. She said she respected the space I needed, but that she hoped someday I'd be willing to hear her out. She didn't beg or apologize in vague cliches. She just said, "I think you deserve to know the truth about that night." I tossed the letter in a drawer and tried to forget it, but the words lingered in my head like a broken melody. I didn't sleep that night. Every argument we'd ever had, every quiet moment we shared, every joke only we understood, it all came back. I hated that I still cared, but the truth was, I did. I wasn't sure if it was love or just the leftover pieces of it, but it had weight. After a week of wrestling with it, I sent her a one-line text. "If you still want to talk, I'll listen." She replied within minutes, asking if we could meet at the coffee shop by the old library. Neutral ground. I said yes, but the moment I hit send, I felt panic. What if she confirmed everything I feared? What if I had built my life on a misunderstanding? Or worse, what if she had nothing to say and I had ruined everything for nothing? I showed up early, heart pounding like I was about to face a jury. The coffee shop hadn't changed. Same mismatched chairs, same chalkboard menu, same faint smell of cinnamon and espresso hanging in the air. I picked a corner seat where I could see the door, trying to breathe through the nervous energy bubbling inside me. When Rachel walked in, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. She looked older, a little thinner, maybe more tired, but still Rachel. Still the woman I had loved for a third of my life. She gave me a cautious smile, one hand clutching her purse like it was an anchor. She ordered tea, and we sat in silence for a minute before she finally said, "Thanks for coming." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. Then she jumped in, not with excuses or tears, but a quiet, firm tone. She told me the man she danced with was a coworker. His name was Mark. They had been working on a big project, and she had invited a few people to join us for drinks after dinner. He arrived early, saw us dancing, and asked her to join him. She hesitated, but she said she didn't want to make a scene. I interrupted, "You looked happy with him." She sighed and said, "Because I was trying to make you jealous." That stopped me cold. She said she felt like I had checked out emotionally months before our anniversary. Always working, always distracted, barely looking at her even when we were in the same room. She wanted to wake me up, to remind me that she was still there. I didn't handle it well, she admitted. It was a stupid, impulsive moment, and I knew the second you left that I had crossed a line. I asked her why she never told me all this before. Her eyes welled up, and she said, "Because you never gave me the chance." She had tried calling, texting, even writing emails she never sent. But after that night, I had shut the door so firmly she didn't know how to knock again. I didn't know what to feel, relieved, angry, sad, maybe all of it. I sat there, stunned, realizing I had been carrying a story in my head for 2 years, and it might not have even been the real one. We sat in that coffee shop for nearly 2 hours, peeling back layers of misunderstanding that had built walls between us for 2 years. She didn't sugarcoat anything, which I appreciated more than I expected. Rachel admitted she had felt neglected for a long time, said she tried to talk to me about it, but I was always too tired, too distracted, too focused on providing and not enough on connecting. She wasn't justifying her actions, but she wanted me to understand her mindset. I told her how betrayed I felt, how humiliating it had been to walk out on our anniversary, thinking she had picked someone else over me. She listened, eyes locked on mine, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were actually hearing each other, not just trading blame or silence. I asked her why she waited 2 whole years to reach out again, and she said she was scared, that maybe I had moved on, that maybe I hated her, or worse, that I didn't care at all anymore. "But I never stopped thinking about you," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "Not a single day." That hit me in a place I didn't know was still tender. I told her about my therapy sessions, about how I kept trying to convince myself I didn't miss her, and how I never really let anyone new in. She smiled sadly and said she hadn't either. There were dates here and there, but no one ever felt quite right. "Because they weren't you," she said. That made my throat tighten. We didn't make promises. We didn't dive into romantic fantasies or talk about getting back together right away. We just acknowledged that something important had broken, and maybe it wasn't entirely unfixable. As we stood to leave, she gently touched my arm and asked if we could talk again soon, even just as friends. I nodded. I wasn't sure where this was heading, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like I was stuck in the past. It felt like a door had opened, one I thought was locked forever. After that first meeting, things didn't transform overnight. There were no dramatic declarations or sudden reunions, just small steps, tentative texts, late-night phone calls, sharing songs we used to love, and cautiously opening up about the pieces of our lives we'd lived apart. We agreed to meet weekly, nothing heavy or intense, just time to relearn each other without the pressure of fixing everything right away. The second time we met up, we talked about our jobs, the things we'd each accomplished alone. She'd been promoted, moved into a nicer apartment, started painting again. I told her I'd finally finished my degree and taken a job I actually liked. There was a mutual respect that hadn't been there before, maybe because now we saw each other clearly, flaws, cracks, growth, and all. One evening, as we walked through a park at sunset, she hesitated before saying, "I think we were both hurting and didn't know how to say it." I agreed. I had been hiding behind work, using it as an excuse to avoid the vulnerability of real conversations. I was scared to confront how much I feared not being enough, not just for her, but in general. She admitted she often felt invisible, like she was just a part of the furniture in our life, not a partner, and instead of confronting that feeling, she chose to provoke something, anything, that might make me notice. The man she danced with? She hadn't spoken to him since that night. I believed her. There was no reason not to now. The honesty between us felt raw, but also cleansing. I started seeing her not as the person who'd hurt me, but as someone who had been hurting too. And in doing that, I realized I hadn't exactly been innocent either. Emotional absence is still absence. Silence is still communication, just the kind that slowly chips away at love. We both had regrets, both had bruises. But somehow, in all that honesty, something fragile but powerful started to rebuild. Not romance, at least not yet, but trust. And that trust felt like a seed. I didn't know if it would grow into love again, or just a deep, mutual respect. But for the first time in years, I wasn't haunted by that night anymore. I was finally understanding it. It was strange how easily certain habits returned, like the way she laughed with her whole face, or how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. Little things I thought I'd forgotten started to reappear like old songs I hadn't heard in years but still knew the lyrics to. But this time, I wasn't seeing them through the lens of nostalgia or heartbreak. I was observing them in the present, without the weight of expectation. Rachel had changed, and so had I. We weren't the same people who had drifted apart under the weight of miscommunication and emotional neglect, and yet there was a comfort in how naturally our rhythm returned, even if it was just friendly for now. One night as we sat on her balcony sipping tea, the city quiet around us, she looked at me and said, "You know, I don't expect anything from you. I'm just grateful you're here." That moment, simple, sincere, stuck with me. It was the opposite of how things ended 2 years ago when everything felt like a performance, a test, a trap. Now things were open-ended. We both had the freedom to leave, but we chose to stay. We started revisiting old memories, not the painful ones, but the good ones. Like our trip to the coast, where we got lost and ended up in a tiny diner eating the best pancakes of our lives. Or the way we used to watch movies in bed on rainy Sundays, wrapped in the same blanket, sharing popcorn and silent laughter. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. They felt warm, like proof that what we had wasn't all bad. It had simply cracked under pressure we didn't know how to face. I could tell she was waiting for me to bring up the idea of trying again, but I didn't, because I wasn't ready and I didn't want to lead her on. She didn't push. That was the new version of us, honest, patient, unforced, and it was enough. I wasn't sure where it would go, but for once I wasn't rushing to label it. I was just letting it be what it was, a connection born from healing, not desperation, something steady, something real, something worth building slowly, if at all. Weeks passed, and we continued to meet, sometimes with purpose and sometimes just to share a moment, coffee runs, grocery shopping, sitting in silence when words weren't necessary. Each encounter felt like it added a brick to something new, something built on clarity and understanding rather than old expectations. Friends started noticing the shift too. My buddy Marcus said, "You look lighter, man, like you're finally breathing again." And he was right. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been clouded by the weight of unresolved emotions, of wondering what if. Rachel seemed lighter too. Her smile didn't feel forced like it used to, and the sadness that once lingered behind her eyes had started to fade. She was taking care of herself, mentally and physically. We talked about therapy. She had started it a few months before we reconnected, and it was helping her understand why she'd made the choices she had. I respected that. She wasn't making excuses, just owning her journey. I told her I was proud of her, and she actually teared up. "You were always proud of me," she said. "I just didn't know how to hear it back then." It hit me how timing can either build or break a relationship. We'd both grown in ways we probably couldn't have if we'd stayed together through those dark times. One evening, while walking out of a bookstore, she stopped me and said, "Would it scare you if I said I still love you?" The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't believe it, but because I didn't expect to hear it spoken out loud so plainly, without fear. I looked at her and replied honestly, "No, it doesn't scare me. But I think love has to look different this time, if we're ever going to try again." She nodded, quietly absorbing what I meant. We both understood that love wasn't enough unless it came with effort, accountability, and mutual care. We weren't in a romance novel. We were in real life, and real love was often complicated, messy, and unfinished. But still, it mattered. She didn't ask me to decide anything then and there. She simply smiled and said, "I'm just glad we're here now." And honestly, so was I. For the first time in forever, it felt like we were finally on the same page. Things shifted again when Rachel invited me to her parents' anniversary dinner. I hadn't seen her family since the split, and part of me hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face the ghosts of what we used to be. But she assured me it wasn't about pressure. It was about inclusion, healing, and showing that we were in a different place now, so I agreed. Walking into that house again stirred memories, both good and bad. Her dad greeted me with a strong handshake and a quiet nod. Her mom pulled me into a hug that lasted just a second too long, as if trying to say what words couldn't. At dinner, Rachel and I sat beside each other, not touching, not overly affectionate, just present. And that quiet presence said everything. Her family noticed it too, how calm and real we were, none of the awkward tension or forced smiles. Later, as the evening wound down, Rachel's mom pulled me aside and said, "Whatever happened before, I can see you both needed that time apart. But I'm glad to see you here again, even if it's just as friends." It meant more than I expected. That night, after I walked Rachel to her car, she leaned against the door and whispered, "I used to dream of this, you know? Us being able to be in a room together and just be okay." I told her I never thought it was possible until recently. We talked in the driveway for nearly an hour, about how our future didn't have to look like our past. Maybe we'd get back together someday, maybe not. But what mattered was the trust we'd rebuilt, the quiet loyalty that had returned without force. I realized then that love isn't always about passion or big gestures. Sometimes it's about presence, about choosing each other day by day, even when it's not romantic, even when it's hard. Rachel said, "I don't want to rush this. I just want it to be real." I agreed. Whatever label we gave it, we were no longer enemies or strangers. We were something else entirely. Two people who had been through the fire and emerged softer, wiser, and more grateful. That to me was already its own kind of love. Months later, on what would have been our anniversary, Rachel and I found ourselves walking through the park where we used to go when we first started dating. It wasn't planned. We were just talking and walking, and our steps naturally took us there. The place hadn't changed much, but we had. As we sat on our old bench overlooking the lake, a quiet breeze blowing and the sun dipping behind the trees, she turned to me and said, "You know, if I could go back and change that night, I would. Not just the dance, but the way I made you feel like you didn't matter." I looked at her, really looked, and saw the honesty in her eyes. "I know," I said, "but maybe if you hadn't made that mistake, we wouldn't be here now, like this, stronger and clearer." We sat in silence for a moment, letting that truth settle between us. We weren't just reliving old memories, we were rewriting them with new meaning. That's when she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a small envelope. "I wrote this a year ago," she said, "but I never sent it." Inside was a letter, raw and heartfelt, apologizing for everything. From the night she danced with that man, to the way she shut me out instead of explaining. It was everything I had once needed but never received. And yet somehow, getting it now felt even more powerful. I didn't cry, but I felt something loosen inside, something that had been clenched for years. After reading it, I looked at her and said, "Thank you, for this, for all of it." We didn't kiss. We didn't confess some grand love. We just held hands quietly like two people who understood each other in a way words couldn't explain. As the light faded, I realized I didn't need closure or a perfect ending. What I needed was exactly what I had now. Truth, peace, and the kind of connection that only comes after you've both been broken and decided to rebuild, piece by piece. Whether we ever called it love again didn't matter. What mattered was that we'd made it through the storm with our hearts still open, and sometimes that's the most beautiful ending of all.